Welcome, everybody. You might recall from a few weeks ago that Melissa joined us and spoke to us about what's going on at CMS in providing services to folks with intellectual disabilities. She then took a lot of questions that you guys had submitted in advance of that last meeting. We did not get through all those questions, and so we invited Melissa back for this session today to answer some more of our questions. And so thank you, Melissa, for making the time and joining us again. So before I launch into some questions, I just want to give you an opportunity. I know you filled us in pretty thoroughly last time as to what's going on, but just checking to see if there's anything new, anything since we last spoke. Otherwise, I'll just launch in.
Thank you, Scott and Ashley, and I appreciate having some additional time to talk with you. I'll flag a couple of documents that CMS issued just last week. Last week was actually a pretty busy week in terms of issuing different information to CMS stakeholders. Two things that I think are of paramount importance and interest to you all. One that we issued on Wednesday of last week, so a week ago today, is a toolkit for Medicaid coverage of the upcoming or the eventual COVID-19 vaccine. The toolkit was issued to provide information to state Medicaid agencies and really the larger body of Medicaid stakeholders on the various moving pieces around how Medicaid is going to reimburse for administering the COVID vaccine. You may have heard in the press that the federal government is planning to purchase an enormous amount of doses of the COVID vaccine. And so you'll see a couple of references in the toolkit to our conversation focusing on coverage and reimbursement of the vaccine administration. That administration is more reimbursing for the physician or the pharmacist or whoever is actually meeting with the beneficiary and injecting the vaccine. It's that administration that states were interested in hearing from us on the various coverage and reimbursement mechanisms under Medicaid. The vaccine itself, the components, the ingredients of the vaccine will be purchased across the board by the federal government. And so there won't be any need to have any Medicaid specific coverage or reimbursement. And so the toolkit goes into some pretty detailed information around who is covered under the Medicaid program for the vaccine during the formal period of the public health emergency and after the period of the public health emergency, and then goes through some other sections of information on managed care implications. There's some language around stakeholder engagement, some pretty clinical information about storage of the actual vaccine. You might be hearing about some of the specifics and the nuances around the physical containment of what we're hearing as the leading contenders of the vaccine. So there's a couple of sections of that as well. So it's on the CMS website, medicaid.gov. And so take a look at it. It's mainly written to our state partners, but we hope it will be helpful for you as well. And certainly we're available to answer any questions at the federal level and could direct you back to your state Medicaid agencies or your other state agencies for questions on how a particular state is going to be moving forward. The second document that we issued on Monday, just 2 days ago, is another toolkit, and it's called the Rebalancing Toolkit. It's also available on the Medicaid.gov website. Rebalancing is kind of a term of art that is used to talk about making sure a state has a spectrum of choices available and is offering robust options for home and community-based care, institutional care. So under the rubric of long-term services and supports, what are the right mix of home and community-based services, institutional services, et cetera? And so a lot of information in that toolkit might be particularly relevant to all of you. There's no new information in there. There's no new policy or no new coverage opportunities or anything like that. It's more like a compilation of all of the existing Medicaid state plan and waiver authorities that can authorize home and community-based services, a nod towards bringing institutions to the table to talk about a state's future strategy for the provision of long-term care. This is all in the name of some of the long-standing rebalancing conversations that CMS has had, but also trying to learn lessons more recently from the public health emergency in terms of where people want to be receiving services, what kinds of settings are needed across the spectrum of Medicaid beneficiary to be providing the right kind of care that people need. It's certainly a conversation that's very variable depending on a particular person's specific needs. So look that over as well. Happy to answer any questions. And again, both of those toolkits are on the Medicaid.gov website. I think those are the two main new documents since we talked a couple of weeks ago. So I'll stop there and then happy to pick up on the Q&A session.
Thank you very much. I'll be very interested to see those toolkits, especially the one on rebalancing. And I'm glad you started off with the COVID stuff, because my first question relates to COVID. And that is, I know during the pandemic, CMS has allowed states and granted states some waivers that sort of relax some of the requirements, give states more flexibility in terms of the providing services. And we were just wondering if, based on what CMS has learned, does CMS intend to retain any of those flexibilities once the pandemic has ended? And if so, which ones seem to be candidates for that?
That's a great question, and one that we have certainly devoted a lot of thinking to behind the scenes. I may have alluded to this the last time we spoke. I can't be sure, and if I am repeating myself, I apologize in advance. But one of the pieces of guidance we will still be issuing is information to states about unwinding. It's kind of a new term that we've coined. As the public health emergency winds down, and it will at some point. I don't know that any of us know when that is, but at some point we will return back to normal operations. And a lot of these temporary waivers that states will have, or states do have, will need to come to an end, and states will need to go back to service delivery and the operation of the Medicaid program the way they were before COVID. And in some cases, states have asked for time to be able to unwind their flexibilities, so there's not an abrupt change in service provision. And so we have been doing some thinking about how these flexibilities used in the context of a public health emergency might be beneficial to retain outside of a public health emergency. And it's certainly a mixed bag, and like so many of the things we do, trying to find the right balance of flexibility and innovation, and leading a lot of decisions to be made at the state level based on state and local conditions. And on the other side, you're making sure that federal requirements are being adhered to, that the services are still being provided in a quality environment. People's service needs are still being met. The taxpayer dollars in the Medicaid program are going for services that really improve beneficiary outcomes and do so in as cost-effective way as possible. And so, if you look in the arena of long-term care, you've got a few different types of waivers that we could be talking about. Sometimes states are amending temporarily their home and community-based waiver programs authorized at 1915C of the Social Security Act. And there is flexibility for that program in a particular appendix called Appendix K, as in kite, that a state can file to add some time limited flexibilities to their waiver program. This is not new. With the COVID public health emergency, we have rolled out this flexibility really in the post Hurricane Katrina days, and states have been using Appendix Ks in man-made disasters or weather-related disasters. And so some of these flexibilities include things like temporarily amending the service array that's available under the waiver. It might be that a state needs to add some services or allow the number of hours of a service to be exceeded based on medical need. It could be that the state needs to temporarily add providers to their universe of existing providers to deliver a service. It could be that services need to be provided in different locations. Before the pandemic, a lot of services were provided in day settings, in residential settings, in someone's private home. It could be that some of those day settings are still really not available because of the social distancing requirements. And so how are states being able to pivot with their provider network to deliver those needed services in a different way, in a different location, maybe through telehealth or some kind of remote technology? So all of those flexibilities are spelled out in a state's Appendix K for the home and community-based waiver. And we've got all of those approvals on our Medicaid.gov website. There are some of those flexibilities that a state could choose to implement long-term outside of a public health emergency. To do so, they would need to modify their actual waiver, their home and community-based waiver, to make a certain time-limited flexibility a permanent part of their waiver. Certainly, states have an awful lot of flexibility around the types of services that a waiver. You see, I had this phone sitting next to me because I knew the chances of going a full hour without getting a spam call were not very good. So apologies for that. States have a lot of discretion for changing up the array of services, the array of providers, the array of settings in which services are provided under their 1915C waivers, and they don't need a public health emergency. They don't need a public health emergency or a temporary authority from CMS to do it, but they need to embed them in their underlying waiver. There are some provisions that are specific to a public health emergency. There is an ability for services temporarily in a public health emergency to be provided in institutions. Obviously, that's kind of a big deal under a home and community-based services authority. While the respite service can be provided, all along, up to, I think, a period of 30 days in an institution outside of a public health emergency, sometimes states need to make broader use of institutions as settings in which a broader array of home and community-based services can be provided in a disaster. That typically can't happen outside of a special authority that some kind of disaster gives CMS to utilize. So there is some, that's an example of an Appendix K flexibility that cannot be embedded into an underlying waiver, but there's an awful lot of Appendix K flexibilities that can be. And so the state's really in the driver's seat at looking at what they have approved in their Appendix K and saying, what do we think makes sense to include in our ongoing waiver as part of our ongoing operations? Stepping outside the 1915C waiver, we have home and community-based services provided in some other authorities. And we have some another type of public health emergency flexibility that we have authorized states to make use of, called the 1135 authority. These are all very technical terms, and it sounds like a lot of citations based on acts of legislation. An 1135 authority is kind of like a waiver authority that is really only available to the federal government during disasters and a federal declaration of a disaster. And so we have used the 1135 authority to allow other service provisions outside of the 1915C. And so sometimes this has authorized changes in the amount of time that can elapse in between reassessments for waiver services. To receive a 1915C waiver service, someone has to be at an institutional level of care, require services in a nursing home, a hospital, an ICF, IID, and generally those level of care redeterminations have to happen annually. The 1135 waiver allows states to have additional time beyond that 12 months in order to conduct reassessments. That is a flexibility CMS can't authorize outside of some sort of disaster. And so that's something that will go away upon the expiration of the public health emergency. So it's very much a mixed bag. And the guidance that we plan to issue on unwinding all of these COVID flexibilities will walk through the options that states have to continue some of these flexibilities long-term, and the ones that CMS cannot authorize outside of a public health emergency and will need to be unwound. That was a very long response. I will try to keep the rest of my responses to questions a little more succinct.
I thought you were just trying to filibuster the rest of the hour. The next question I have is, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, but the settings rule and the way in particular, at least that some states are interpreting it, make it very difficult for men and women with the most significant needs to be served in settings that comply with the settings rule, or at least as states are interpreting that. The small homes and apartments and that sort of stuff. Some folks with the most significant needs need a different kind of setting with more supports than they would get in a small home or an apartment. And so we're just wondering what can be done by CMS to allow folks with the most significant needs to be served in a waiver funded setting.
So I would say a couple of things. The spectrum of needs that individuals in any of our home and community-based services authorities brings to the table has always been pretty daunting in terms of establishing a set of criteria that is supposed to have applicability across everyone. As you look at the differences in the types of people who are receiving Medicaid-funded HCBS, you've got people all along the age spectrum, people with very different types of disabilities, and people within even a population like older adults, people with a developmental disability. You've got a wide variety of the scope of support needs that people have. And so if you look at some of the settings criteria, some of them seem, rather foundational, to the provision of services, whether they're Medicaid funded or not, talking about people being treated with respect and dignity, things like that. And then you get into some other ones, particularly those that are a little more philosophical, like facilitating community engagement, facilitating individuals making daily or making choices based on autonomy and choices on employment and things like that. Certainly, different people different Medicaid beneficiaries are going to bring different interests and goals and support requirements and natural supports and all sorts of variables with them as they are coming to the table to have a person-centered service plan developed for them. And that service plan is supposed to cross not only Medicaid funded services and supports, but really to be a holistic picture of what that individual needs to have their preferences and goals met. And it's such a critical portion or component of the Medicaid settings regulation. And we know that it's kind of a, it takes on different meaning across states and across different service types. And we're working with some of our federal partners to really provide some good resources to beef up and provide some more guidance on how to really make sure the person-centered planning process is as robust as possible, because an awful lot of compliance with the settings rule hinges on that person-centered planning process working. And so if you've got somebody with pretty significant support needs and you're sitting down with him or her to try to nail down a person-centered service plan, that plan could end up looking very, very different, and should end up looking very, very different from someone else who has a totally different array of service needs, has a different array of people in his or her life who are helping with the culmination of the goals in that person-centered service plan. The beauty of the settings requirements is that while there are some standardized criteria in the regulation, the how of the way those criteria are actually brought to life has to be by design very beneficiary specific. And so it could be that employment is not a goal of a particular person, and that's fine. We would expect to see virtually no discussion of employment services in that person's person-centered service plan. Not true for someone who really wants to either for the first time attain some kind of employment or wants to increase the level of employment that they have in the community. We would expect that plan to really have much more granularity around how to make progress in attaining those employment supports. And so the types of settings that a state has to either provide residential supports or non-residential supports, also by design has to be able to bring different types of expertise into the mix of home and community-based service provision. And there's no formula or exhaustive list of settings that CMS thinks can or cannot be compliant with the settings rule. It all comes down to how the state is assessing a particular provider against our federal criteria, how a provider is able to say, here's how I am facilitating the beneficiaries in my care, whether I'm providing day services, whether I'm providing residential services, it doesn't really matter. Here's how I, as a provider, am putting that individual in charge of setting their own course in their person-centered plan. And here's how I, as a provider, am bringing my expertise to the table to help satisfy the goals of that plan. We're not expecting a particular provider to be the end-all be-all of how someone's person-centered plan comes to life. That would be an unfair expectation on any Medicaid provider. What we're expecting providers to do is to have an operational foundation that allows individuals to chart their own course. And that course is going to look very different depending on what kind of services and supports they need, what kind of services and supports the state provides in Medicaid, how non-Medicaid supports, including natural supports, need to wrap around paid services, and how that all comes together as articulated in the person-centered plan. And so again, it's the relationship that a provider has with their state Medicaid agency or the agency in the state that oversees programs for people with intellectual or developmental disabilities is so critical. Equally critical is understanding how your state has laid out their strategy for ensuring compliance with the regulation in the statewide transition plan, because that's really going to tell the tale about what a state will be expecting of you as providers. But if you're hearing from your state that there's a particular type of provider the state does not think will be able to achieve compliance with the settings rule, chances are that is not a CMS CMS directive that might be a state interpreting our regulation.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. It's always good to hear you articulate the flexible view of CMS. The problem we're having, as you point out, is that ultimately the settings rule gets implemented at the state level. Mm-hmm. And it's there where we're really running into problems with the lack of flexibility. So just to, sort of take it one step further, a lot of times folks with the most significant support needs need to be served, can only feasibly be served in a larger setting. And there are states that, for example, say, if you're serving more than 4 individuals in a setting, you are not considered by us to be a home and community-based setting. You don't qualify for our waiver funding. And that makes it virtually impossible for those with higher support needs to be served in a waiver-funded setting. And I know your reaction might be, well, that's the state's prerogative to do that. We can't tell the states what to do. But I think it's here where I just think CMS can play a very important role to talk to the states how, as you've said before, you need to provide a full range of services. And by that, I don't mean just an ICF model and a waiver model, but within the waiver, allow for more larger settings, more congregate settings, so that folks that need that kind of setting can have the services that they need and can live where they wish to live. So is there anything CMS can do to try to work with the states that are being more restrictive to try to introduce more flexibility when the state is implementing and applying the settings rule within their jurisdictions?
When we were years and years ago, when we were first trying to take a crack at the development of the HCBS criteria, we kicked around having size thresholds. A facility below X beds had a better shot of becoming home and community based. A facility over X beds had a tougher time. We ended up walking away from that because it was very hard to adjudicate or to have such a black and white standard without, really being able to allow one setting to be judged on its own merits. And so I will say that that I agree with the in some cases it might sound like a good idea to have size thresholds. It might seem like a pretty easy way to facilitate a setting adhering to the criteria by making it smaller. I think philosophically, I agree that as the size increases, it's harder to be able to achieve on a person by person basis compliance with the settings rule, but not impossible. That's why there is no federal size threshold. For states that are implementing a size threshold, I think they need to figure out what kind of system, to your point, Scott, they're going to be left with. On the one hand, you've got institutions, which can be any number of beds. Some institutions are quite small. Other institutions are quite large. And so you've got that on one side. And then you've got, as the state's trying to move towards smaller, more person-centered, integrated community settings, that's great. And for the people who can really thrive in those settings, they will have a big supporter in CMS. To your point, there's a whole lot of people in the middle. And, I think that's going to be the challenge for states, is to make sure that people who don't really need to be in an institution have a choice of a non-institutional setting, but they might have a hard time having their needs met, in a particular look or feel of a home and community-based setting. I mean, I think we can all agree, and I've seen a couple of questions come through on the chat, people who have really significant support needs, people who are, pretty significantly disabled, particularly with an intellectual disability, are very hard, to really, it's quite hard to find the right service array that is going to, put them in a position, to be able to have a say in their life, recognizing that they might need a whole lot of supports from people, parents, family members, guardians, other people in the community who by necessity have to be part of their lives. And so, our goal at CMS is to work with the states and make sure that the right array of services or the right array of providers are going to be available to be providing services to people. It's not really a win, if you have a reliance on two types of services, institutions and fully integrated settings. You do need to have something in between for the people who have the higher support needs. Now, can someone with who needs a significant amount of help be served in their own apartment, in a private residence, in a fully integrated, very small setting HCBS provider? Absolutely, yes. Is that the right setting for every single person? I am sure not. And so how do you, really recognize the diversity in your population and make sure you've got home and community-based settings that adhere to the settings rule, but they can do so in different ways that still allows the individuality of all of their beneficiaries to really be at the forefront. And so it's quite hard, but that's why a standard like a size threshold is not in the federal regulations. And, we would say to a state, we just need to make sure that all of your people are accounted for. I saw a question about is CMS's policy against Olmstead. I promise you it's not. We are, while we are not the agency that administers the Olmstead decision, we have colleagues in the Department of Justice and the Office of Civil Rights who have the literal oversight of Olmstead. We administer in CMS Medicaid. And it's a true statement that sometimes Title 19 of the Social Security Act and the Olmstead decision about caring for individuals in the most integrated setting are not always best friends. Title 19 has a mandate to provide services in institutions, and all of this home and community-based service array is at state option. And so sometimes, there's a bit of a disconnect, but the entirety of the settings rule is to give states a really powerful tool to comply with the Olmstead integration mandate. And so we do try to set up our long-term care policy in a way for Medicaid that makes it easier for states to comply with Olmstead, because we know Medicaid is such a primary payer of long-term care. We do our best to not be at cross purposes with Olmstead. And yet we recognize that institutions are a mandatory component of Medicaid. And, we are not trying to say that every institution needs to shut its doors, that every beneficiary in an institution needs to be, to come out. But we are saying that states need to make sure they've got a really good array of choices, meaningful choices. So a beneficiary and his or her family members, the ones who are helping to really, make decisions, can make an informed choice about what setting is best for a particular person.
So again, you're saying lots of great stuff. The problem is getting it implemented at the state level. So, we know there are states that say to qualify for Medicaid waiver funding in this state, there can be no setting that serves more than 4 individuals. And so the question is, when you see that, when CMS sees that, does CMS do anything to go to that state and say, you know what, this is not a good idea. This is not good policy, because you're leaving out a whole set of folks that can't be served, can't have their needs met in that kind of a restrictive, under that kind of a restrictive regime. In Illinois, for example, I'm working with the state right now that in the process of revising its rules to comply with the settings rule. And they're talking about having things like, in an apartment building, no more than 25% of the units can be used to serve an individual with a disability. You can't have 2 group homes within 600 feet of each other, things like that preclude certain kinds of settings, specifically, disability specific settings, even if they comply with the settings rule. And what that does obviously is limit choice, and it disqualifies folks that need those kinds of settings from being able to live in a waiver funded setting. And so again, my question really is, I know you have some sympathy for our concerns here, but what does CMS actually do when it sees a state implementing the settings rule in that kind of way, so that it does limit choice and it limits options?
So, I think what we would say to a state, not so much to say to a state, it's not good policy. I think that is more a matter of opinion than federal guidance that CMS would say to a state. I think what is our responsibility, though, is to say, walk us through your decision process where you think your implementation of the settings rule, the way you've got it laid out in your statewide transition plan, is going to result in enough compliance settings to provide home and community-based service for all of the people in your state that need them. And part of the rebalancing conversations that we are kind of challenging all states to have is taking a look right now at their existing system in terms of institutional use, HCBS use, figuring out the types of settings that are in play right now in the HCBS, and then making some short-term and longer-term strategies, investments about where the state wants to take home and community-based services. These are decisions that don't come quickly. They can't be implemented quickly in most cases, and require a lot of coordination with housing agencies. If people are coming out of institutions, or if the state's going to be relying on small numbers of physical spaces, where are people going to be housed? Where are they going to live, such that they are living in a residential setting that is compliant with the settings rule? Those are things that it is our responsibility to ask the state about. Have you thought about the capacity of your home and community-based services system to care for all the people who need services right now? Look at your roles of waiver participation. Look at the people on your waiting list. What's your plan for being able to serve people on that waiting list and whittle down? Look at the people who are in institutions right now. What's your plan on giving them broader options in the community? But if you're going to be bringing people out, how are you going to care for them in the community? Not just that they are in ways in which they are existing in the community, but thriving in the community, having their needs met, being able to interact with others in their community. And to do that, you need housing, you need an HCBS provider workforce, you need a robust array of home and community-based services, you need an array of employment supports, for individuals who want to be pursuing employment. How are all of those things working together in your HCBS system? It's not just a matter of complying with the settings regulation. It's having your whole HCBS system strong enough to be able to handle the number of people in your state who need long-term care. And those people are going to be bringing a whole host of varied conditions. And they're all going to be looking at you to be able to provide them, you as in the state, to provide them with the right kinds of options. So how state, as you're laying out your plan in your statewide transition plan, how are you making sure that your system is set up, to accommodate all the people who needs it?
Thank you, Melissa. What is CMS doing with respect to states that are still following the pre-March 2019 guidance under the settings rule? How are you making sure that states are cognizant of and taking proper account of the revised guidance that you issued in March of 2019?
I imagine you're talking about heightened scrutiny and, for example, a state saying that every farmstead is presumed isolating and would need to come in, for heightened scrutiny. We have been having our team in CMS has been having conversations with states as we understand how a state is implementing heightened scrutiny. Sometimes that is laid out more from a process standpoint in their statewide transition plans. Sometimes states are actually submitting individual settings to us for heightened scrutiny review. I will say that has slowed significantly during the public health emergency. State attention, understandably, has been diverted to public health emergency response activities. And so, we do want to understand how states are determining the settings to send to us that require a CMS heightened scrutiny review. And if it's clear that a state is not implementing their own heightened scrutiny work, according to the most recent heightened scrutiny guidance, we do make sure they understand the nuances of it. And so we would make sure a state understands we don't expect to see every setting that is a farmstead or a gated community, unless the state has made an assessment of each individual provider and determined that those providers meet the criteria of an isolating setting and need to come to CMS. And then it's even more nuanced than that because of the timing that we talked about in the March FAQs, which was July 1, 2020. It's now July 1, 2021, where a setting that was isolating but has now remediated into compliance by July 1, 2021, won't need to come to CMS. And so, for states who had submitted, quote, isolating settings to us already, we went back to them and said, looking at these settings through the lens of the new guidance, theoretically, they should not be here anymore because you should not have, again, theoretically, submitted them to CMS unless you made a determination that they met the criteria of isolation and overcame it in your assessment and adhere to the settings rule. And if that's the case, then the state was able to abide by what was in the March 2019 FAQs that said that setting does not need to come to CMS because it had remediated into compliance, by that time frame. It's all, very technical, and I might not have been very artful saying that. And so most states did pull back an awful lot of settings that they had submitted to us under the heading of isolating because they wanted to, really study the March 2019 FAQs, figure out what that meant for the settings that they had flagged as isolating, determine whether they needed to come to CMS at all, or determine whether they could use the time frame until July 1 to remediate into compliance and avoid coming into CMS. And so I would say that the number of settings that the state sent to us for isolation did in fact go way down. And we are still encouraging states to take another look and make sure that the settings they have in front of us are because the states really want us to take a look. There are some states that say, you know, this is what I'm seeing, you know, in a particular type of setting. I'm sending it to CMS for a heightened scrutiny review. It might be completely unrelated to a farmstead or a gated community. There are some states that just kind of, you know, want our input on a particular setting. That might be very different from a setting that requires heightened scrutiny. But you know, we do want to make sure that states are not sending settings to us that we really don't need to see. The goal is to, you know, to have most of the settings adjudicated by the state, and the state stand by their assessment of whether that setting is in compliance with the settings rule or can be in compliance by the various timeframes.
Thank you. Let me just make one more observation, then I'll move on with another question. You know, I've had state regulators say to me that one reason why they are restrictive and not allowing farmsteads and campus settings and other congregate settings to qualify for waiver funding in the state is they simply don't want to go through the heightened scrutiny process. They don't want to go through all the time and effort and resources that it takes to go through that process. So they're only going to authorize those settings that they can automatically deem comply with the settings rule. And again, I'm not asking you to respond to that. I'm just saying this is what I've been told by state regulators. And so, you know, really the whole heightened scrutiny aspect of the settings rule, I think, is a very inhibiting part of the rule. And I've always felt that since the rule contains a pretty definitive definition of what a community setting is, that if you meet that definition, you don't need to have a heightened scrutiny section. You either meet that definition of a community setting that's in the rule, or you don't, because I think the heightened scrutiny aspect of it does turn out to be a very inhibiting and restrictive part of the rule that states are using to, you know, avoid having to deal with this whole issue of the more congregate type settings. That's just an observation. My question relates to, again, the March 2019 guidance, and specifically question 13. I'm sure you've got all these memorized. You don't need to even look at it, I'm sure. But part of CMS's response to question 13, it says as follows: a state may decide to require beneficiaries receiving Medicaid funding.
So I don't know if it's my computer, you were a little bit garbled.
Oh, sorry. Maybe I'm covering up the microphone. Can you hear me better now? Melissa? Oop, I think.
Gist. You know, I think I got the gist of your question about, you know, states shying away from particular types of settings to avoid heightened scrutiny. And, you know, I imagine that's true. You know, I have had a lot of conversations with states and a lot of conversations with providers, including some of you in this group, where the whole idea of heightened scrutiny or avoiding heightened scrutiny was viewed as like a pass-fail. And if a setting needed to come in under heightened scrutiny, it was an automatic black mark and an automatic short trip to being determined to be not home and community based. And that's really a shame. I know when we were authoring the regulation, you know, we did not intend for the heightened scrutiny provision to become such a Megillah, you know, in this regulation. It was really done to make sure that settings that either were so physically part of an institution that sometimes it was hard to tell it from an institution, really were abiding by the home and community-based settings criteria. A cohort of settings that CMS defined as isolating, really did adhere to the criteria. There's no separate set of criteria that a setting coming under heightened scrutiny needs to adhere to. Everyone kind of has the same test of whether the criteria in the regulation are being met. And so there are some settings that absolutely cannot avoid heightened scrutiny because they are located inside the same building as a public or private institution, or they're on the same grounds of a public institution. There's no way around heightened scrutiny for those type of settings. But the point of heightened scrutiny is just to say, the state has adjudicated you in compliance with the settings rule. CMS is doing a confirmation of the state's process and the state's findings for you. And as long as that setting is meeting the settings rule, there should be no problem. And so again, it's just, kind of teaching to the same test. It's saying to all settings, whether you're a assisted living wing in a nursing home or a cottage on an ICF campus, the only thing you have to do is adhere to the settings rule, and then heightened scrutiny should be no problem. I would say that same conversation to a state. Now, if a state says, I want to move away from settings on the grounds of an institution or settings in the same building as an institution, we're not going to say as CMS, you can't make that decision. I will say that because of where we are now, enmeshed in a public health emergency, and institutions are, I would say, a little more motivated, to have conversations around diversification of business lines, where they see themselves fitting into larger community strategies. A state might find themselves, looking at ways to utilize existing physical footprints of institutions a little differently than they thought, even this time last year. One of the reasons that we extended the time frame for complying with the settings rule by another year is to give states that time to really have those systemic, where do we go from here? Where is this relationship going kind of conversation? What lessons are we learning from the public health emergency? What lessons have we been learning over the decades of providing home and community-based services that we really need to bring to establishing a vision for where we're going? If we've got a bunch of nursing homes that now have reduced bed usage, where do we go? Is there a new appetite to use wings of a nursing home for an assisted living or wings of a nursing home for an adult day? You still have the problem of shared space in a congregate setting from a public health perspective. How do you take those diversification conversations and look at them through the lens of retaining strong businesses in your community, as you're talking about the financial stability of your community, and making sure that people are safe from an infectious disease? Again, hard conversations, but they need to be had, and they need to be had with enough time without a ticking federal clock, beating down on you. And so, as states are having conversations around where they want to have home and community-based settings provided, that's automatically going to bring heightened scrutiny to the table. And so I would encourage any state to say, what are my options? What's my inventory right now of where home and community-based services are provided? Are there spaces that I'm not making maximum use of as I look to grow my capacity for home and community-based services? Do some of those spaces require heightened scrutiny? Maybe yes, maybe no. That should not be a make or break. It just means that the state and CMS need to take an extra look to make sure the settings rule is actually being implemented, but it's the same criteria that everyone's being held to. And I would say the same things to you all. that I know that we've had a lot of conversations around heightened scrutiny. And, I would get a little more and more direct in some of those conversations at saying the point of heightened scrutiny is just making sure you meet the reg. So make sure you meet the reg. That's what you have to do. And some of the changes we've made in the last several years or so to kind of lighten or dim the spotlight on particular types of settings at saying these are the types we think might have the biggest shot of being isolating. We've kind of turned that down and said, look, to states, evaluate every setting on its own merits. Those that don't meet our criteria of isolation don't need to come to CMS. Those that do might not need to come to CMS if they achieve compliance by a particular date. Those that still need to come to CMS, what you have to do is describe how the setting meets the reg. And so I would hope heightened scrutiny, would stop being such a big distraction for all of us, you, me, and the states, and really just get back to the business of making sure the fundamental settings criteria are what's carrying the day for a particular type of setting.
Lisa, I think we have time for perhaps one more question. I think you're aware that the Kaiser Foundation publishes data on lots of things, but in particular on services for folks with disabilities. And that data indicates that those with IDD who are receiving services are predominantly white, predominantly male. Is CMS aware of this? And is CMS aware that there seems to be some inequity in the provision of services to folks of color with IDD? And if so, what is CMS doing about that?
We try to keep try to keep abreast of information coming out around data, and it's sometimes kind of an overwhelming task. But Kaiser Family Foundation is a really reliable source of information, and so we do particularly try to keep abreast of information coming from them. I think it's not a secret that racial disparities are something that has yet to be really tackled within the Medicaid program. We certainly don't claim to have really moved beyond racial disparities like that. I don't have a magic bullet. I think the goal of the real goal of the settings rule doesn't care what ethnicity you are, doesn't care whether you're an older white woman, a younger African-American man, doesn't care. The settings criteria is really meant to say, here's how a Medicaid funded service should be supporting you. And again, based on your personal circumstances and what your needs are, that's how your service plan should be set up, to provide you with the most appropriate supports, both Medicaid funded and non. But we have a ways to go, for certain. There are across different urban and rural landscapes, some of the choice offerings are different, and across states, people have different arrays of choices. I think that's one of the main reasons why we're all here, is to make sure that and the premise of choice and informed choice is as real as it can be. But I don't think anyone thinks, that we've got it figured out in Medicaid. And, to all of you, to the extent that you've got suggestions on how to lessen any kind of disparity like that, I think we're all ears. But that is certainly one of the goals of the settings rule, is to make sure that regardless of where you live, and who you are, that you've got the right service array, the right providers, the right choices of where you live, where you spend your time, how you interact with your community. That is certainly the goal.
Thank you, Melissa. I think we've come to the end of our hour. Appreciate you taking all the time and all the questions. Thank you, everybody, for joining this call. hopefully maybe sometime in the new year, as we maybe see the pandemic hopefully winding down, we can reconvene and maybe we'll have some new questions for you.
Well, I don't doubt that. I see 50 questions in the chat, and I'm sure I touched on maybe, 2 or 3. So, look, we could have a weekly series, and I still would not, be able to really scratch the surface of questions. I'm happy to come back. It would probably behoove us to do so after a couple of months have passed. We'll figure out together what all is different, in our collective lives and where we think we're going. But I'm happy to do that. And these are really hard questions. The states don't have easy answers. The feds don't have easy answers. But I'm happy at least to provide you with some insight into what CMS is thinking.
Great. We really appreciate the insight that you're providing.
Right. All right.
Thank you, everybody.